Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to our Report Out event, which is focused on the climate emergency and its effects on queer populations or LGBTQ plus populations, however you prefer to say, worldwide. We are honoured today to have Lewis Chan, who is one of our Report Out trustees, who has a particular remit for sustainability and the climate emergency. You'll see much more of Lewis later, but please give a very, very warm welcome, beaming all the way in from Singapore, which is exciting. And my name is Drew Dalton. My pronouns are he, him. I am the founder and chair of Report Out, a chair of trustees. And we are now celebrating our 4-year birthday party. So this is exciting times. So we decided to host an event based around what we have been doing, some of our research into the climate emergency, and also some of what we are doing as an organization as well, because we believe it's imperative that we should be having these discussions. And so do feel free to use the chat function. Feel free to put any questions, comments, opinions, or anything in there. And this will come in two parts. There will be myself first, where I will be going through my presentation, which is called "Have We Left Behind the Rainbow Warriors?" Meaning us, as LGBT populations, and looking at the climate emergency itself, and how we are uniquely tied to this. So it's welcome to her. It's a really interesting position to take. If anyone would like to follow me on Twitter, feel free, or I should call it X now, shouldn't I? If anyone wants to follow on X, feel free, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to make new connections. Okay, so I'm going to make a start, and this will also be going on YouTube. And afterwards, about a week or so later, where you'll be able to watch this and share this with other people. So the hope is that this goes beyond this event and other people then can continue to view this as well. So, okay, I'm ready to begin. So I hope everyone sit back, ready to listen. And if you have any questions, we'll answer them at the end. So, okay then. Please note that during this talk, I'm going to be using the phrase queer. And I'm using that really to describe sexual and gender minorities, or LGBTQIA plus, as a shorthand umbrella term. So I'm going to be using the term queer in this talk. The reason why I'm doing that is because it's an inclusive term, and maybe some people culturally, depending where you are in the globe, may not describe yourself using identity labels like LGBTQI plus. So that's the reason I use the term as a nice umbrella term to encompass us all. So let's get into the topic matter. So what is the actual climate emergency? And please note my terminology here. I prefer not to call this climate change. And the reason why is because I think when we start talking about climate change, we see this as a gradual, slow-moving thing. I actually believe that we are in a state of climate emergency. And so we should be thinking about using our terminology in a slightly different way. We're seeing the long-term effects of what's been happening out there, and that is affecting our communities globally. So I will be using the term climate emergency unless it's used or by somebody else or cited by somebody else as climate change. What this is essentially are any changes to our global climate, which is result from enhanced greenhouse effects, which are obviously caused by greenhouse gases. This could be carbon dioxide, which is predominantly from the burning and use of fossil fuels, but not exclusively. In 2018, some people may be very familiar that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, launched a report saying that there is a huge impact of global warming if global temperatures exceed the 1.5 degrees guardrail, which could be exceeded by 2030. And this has long-term, long-running effects on the globe itself and is certainly starting to be felt by us all as we look around the world. But it's recognizing in this report that this is essentially human-made impact. And the report itself outlines a series of very catastrophic environmental disasters which would happen on Earth should we go above that 1.5C guardrail. Basically, these rapid changes will mean that the Earth will see a succession of very harmful extreme weather events, or EWEs. That same report also forecasted a rise of 2.5%, 2.5 degrees to 10 degrees over potentially the next century. And folks, if we should be worried about this one because this means the elimination of life and significant changes to the lives of humans as well. So we're starting to see effects of this already. We're seeing changing weather patterns in intensity, frequency, and the duration of hurricanes. We are starting to see some of the strongest hurricanes, i.e. category 4 and 5, which have increased since the 1980s, according to NASA. And our global warming sea level has risen by about 20 centimeters since reliable record keeping started in 1880. And this is largely due to melting ice caps, glaciers, and floating ice, which are affecting coastal areas and island nations. Now, at this point, it's probably worth knowing that most of the world's population have shifted now. We're not exclusively a rural or globe. Most of the world's populations about 4 years ago have shifted into urban areas. So there are more people now living in urban areas. Those urban areas are usually within 75 miles of a sea. And so this has impacts on our urban centres. And this is projected to rise these sea levels, but potentially between 30 centimeters to even 243 centimeters but, at a peak, which will see additional storm surges, increased flooding for about 100 years, even if we stop all carbon emissions now. Worryingly, that means that we live within largely about 100 kilometers, most of people, and that's shifting even more. And that means that because they live within a very short area of a coastline, they are at risk of flooding. And if our sea levels continue to rise, we will see 600 million of these people living in what we call a low-level coastal zone, which means increased risks of flooding. But it's not just about melting ice caps and hurricanes. It's also about human impacts in terms of increased resource scarcity, which has led to water wars in parts of the world. We are seeing risks to water supplies, food insecurity, and due to ocean acidification, or the ocean becoming more acidic, we are seeing failing fishing industries, much more heat stress, where we are seeing some of our summers become hotter than ever before. And the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015, gathered the global governments together to state that we need to keep this temperature rise well below the 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And as of about 3 years later, about 175 parties or governments had ratified this agreement and agreed it. Many had then communicated their intentions to contribute toward reduced emissions. And also, hopefully, alongside that, the UN launched their Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which means that all of these 17 goals, with goal 13 being climate action, should be met by 2030. So there's a hopefulness there, but whether that translates to reality is, of course, something else. But what we are seeing in terms of climate action trackers is largely those people who signed that agreement and ratified it. We are seeing this being led by the global south. Many of those who are really pushing to kind of and recognizing probably the deep effects on their own nations. We're seeing countries who are really trying to hit that 1.5 agreement. We're seeing other ones largely in the global north, but not exclusively, who have initially perhaps been the cause of the climate emergency, whereas we're seeing global south countries being affected heavily by it, which has raised a lot of discussions at a larger global level. So really, this begs the question, and linked to us ourselves, how does this climate emergency affect all of us right now? What evidence of this do you see? And really, are we viewing it as an emergency in our daily lives? So you'll have to excuse me for being slightly sociological on this one, folks. I'm going to introduce a little bit of theory because I am a sociologist. It's what we do. Um, but we need to be thinking of it, as Giddens calls it, as a back of the mind issue. In fact, the climate emergency has become a bit of a paradox. We're talking about it in mainstream debate. It's been touched upon in our global governance, but really, is it a pressing issue amongst some or most of the world's population? Um, Anthony Giddens calls this the Giddens paradox and says there are three problematic areas that remain at the core of our narratives, our discussions when we're tackling the climate emergency. Firstly, many people in the electorates, your general public, can't seem to grasp the significance of this climate emergency. People view it as abstract, not dramatic enough. They're perhaps not noticing changes, and they view it as distant from their own lives and lived experience. And Giddens actually says that many people won't understand the consequences of this until they see the most catastrophic results. But secondly, it's not only the electorates on the ground. Another unique challenge is that it's not a subjective debate which gets pushed away and can be pushed away and dealt with later. This is actually something we need to be dealing with now. So therefore, climate disaster has become this seeming concern of the distant future, or as he calls it, a back of the mind issue, which means it's become much less attractive to act now. Instead, many countries would rather boost their economies and still continue the way they are, rather than thinking about the long-term harm. And therefore, the longer this issue gets debated and fought over, as more and more of this pollution is happening, it's exacerbating the issue even further. And then finally, his third point, which he raises, is he talks about the problem with people who've become free riders, who have ample opportunity to tackle climate change, but instead wait for others to do so. As he himself says, since the dangers posed by global warming aren't tangible, immediate, or visible in your day-to-day life, many will sit on their hands and do nothing of a concrete nature about them. Yet waiting until these disasters become visible and acute in the shape of catastrophes, which are irrefutably the result of climate change, only that will stir people into action, but sadly, that will be too late. So this is why at Report Out we've engaged with this. We don't want to become free riders. We actually want to engage with the debate and the discussion and put practical actions. What he does state is that what we need behind this is an enabling state as an institution to mold our behaviors, to get us switched on to the idea of climate change and climate emergency, to develop hard-hitting policies for reshaping our social behaviors. But again, that could come with problems, couldn't it? Who is going to take this on board? Will this be a UN thing? Will nation states be proactive in doing this? How can we form an enabling state to help us to do this, especially if some of our populations are being left behind, which I'll come to. So that's a little bit of the theory, and also a little bit about what the climate emergency is. But we're always told that climate emergency is the great equalizer. It affects all of us equally, when in actual fact it doesn't. It's very, very heteronormative and very cisnormative in the debates that have been happening. And I'll go deeper into why this is the case soon. But what we're seeing is that the climate justice conversation has not really engaged with many marginalized groups, such as people living with disabilities, or LGBTQI plus populations, and in particular migrants and refugees, who've tended to be left out of these discussions, yet largely will be on the front line of facing the climate emergency. So the debate itself has become deeply heteronormative and cisnormative. And whilst it's accurate that it affects all of us, we clearly know it's felt unevenly across different places in the world, across spaces, and across different populations. And much of this discussion about climate action and the Sustainable Development Goals has been at UN levels, where unfortunately we have several countries who will block any discussion about involvement of sexual and gender minorities or queer people. And it hasn't been really forthcoming in terms of the debates which are out there. Instead, the focus has been on women and girls as a deeply homogenous, one strike hits all grouping, which actually we know that cultures around the world in terms of gender minorities are far more complex than that. And this in itself, in both our response to it, our response to climate disasters and extreme weather events, and our humanitarian aid afterwards, has had a focus on women and girls, and that has come with its own problems too, which I'll go into and give examples of. So, okay, an example of this is the Gully Queens, just to bring this to life. The self-titled Gully Queens face the unique combination, as you'll see with most of the rest of the case studies we're going to talk about today, face the intersections of their state-led and community-led homophobia and transphobia, but also the fact that nobody has considered the intersection of the climate emergency with their lives. Many of them have fled their communities and or family homes because of family rejection, and they are based in Kingston in Jamaica. Most of them are young people, and they have to resort to petty crime, begging, and or sex work to survive, and they're living in some of the deepest levels of poverty. They've come together to assemble as a small queer community to live in the precarious safety of the city's gullies. Now, gullies are there to stop to drain flood water when it floods quickly, and they live in those areas. These gullies are 6 to 9 feet wide, and they lie below the street level because they drain the rainwater and the city's refuse out to sea. Through living in this open location, they face both the sustained attacks from the public because they're visible in the open gullies, but they're also vilified by the press, and they face regular raids by police forces and confiscation of their property. But there is simply nowhere else for them to go in Jamaica. The threats linked to this, when we look at a wider level, is that Jamaica's 2.93 million people are facing serious threats from hotter temperatures and droughts, but also flash flooding, which is linked to climate change. And these waterways, which have become a place of safety to them, have actually become a potential hazard, with a real and very clear risk of drowning as these gullies swell due to freak and sudden flooding due to extreme weather events. And with this risk of their lives being affected by the climate emergency, compounded by additional state homo and bi-transphobia and familial rejection, they have no spaces left to go. So they are on the front end of extreme weather events. And that, therefore, we see a tangible link between institutional homophobia and transphobia and the effects of the climate emergency on those gully queens themselves. It's a classic case study of how we need to bring together some of these larger effects of the climate emergency. But we also know that queer people globally are on the front line of this climate emergency, and largely because homelessness is a key factor. We think that about 150 million people worldwide are homeless, which stands at about 2% of the world's global population. The numbers are probably going to be much, much higher than this, but it's a figure to get us going with. It's estimated that between 20 to 40% of that homeless population are asexual or gender minority. And whilst that isn't tracked evenly across the globe, that's a sizable population of the homeless population worldwide who are going to be facing extreme weather events. That means that because they live in inadequate and or temporary housing or none at all, they are going to be front facing of any natural calamity, any temperature rises, and of course, polluted airs. So we're seeing kind of asthma, respiratory problems faced by them due to smog and the effects of the climate emergency in that sense. We're also seeing people baking alive, essentially, in hot temperatures, living homeless and not having access to water. And this means that this group of people face not only these physical conditions, but also they may then choose sex work and begging, which actually then further criminalizes them. And that exposes them to not only the effects of the climate emergency, but therefore from police and municipal authorities who will make it difficult for them to then access government services should a climate disaster happen. For example, if you are living homeless in a country which criminalizes you and you're homeless because you are queer, then that's very difficult for you to then go to government services and or the police for support should an accident or an extreme weather event happen. It's all about the blockages that get put in place for people in their populations. Hope everyone's following okay so far. And I was really highlighted this when I went to Panama. And this set of islands is just off the coast in the Pacific Ocean. There lives the Gunayala. The Gunayala are indigenous peoples. They have a third sex or third gender, I should say. And they live on these islands, living off tourism, predominantly these days. And this island space itself is predicted within the next 20 years to be absolutely underwater. Some of the islands have already gone underwater. And this is a sacred space where indigenous people who are queer people have lived here for thousands of years. So this is another real life example, just like the Gully Queens, who are seeing their places affected by rising sea levels and sea temperatures. So that means that we need to consider what happens when these natural disasters, or they're not natural, they're human-made, extreme weather events appear. We need to be considering these in light of international aid and reconstruction. So we need to be having a discussion not only with climate emergency, but also humanitarian aid organizations. This lack of visibility of many queer people actually needs to be considered in the allocation of resources to people after an extreme weather event. Because currently we're seeing little to no support after these extreme events have happened for many queer populations. The Human Dignity Trust says that natural disasters, climate emergencies unmake our queer homes. They destroy queer communities in their wake, alongside everyone else's communities. But very often our own queer communities are the only place in which people can hide in safety, potentially as a safe house, which is destroyed by an extreme weather event, or community centre. And that also affects our wider sense of queer belonging too, because this not only destroys the residences belonging to queer people, their families, their support networks, it also elevates their own anxieties and concerns about their privacy and discrimination for people who go to refuge shelters after an extreme weather event. And this also means that any kind of neighborhoods or queer neighborhoods or any areas where people hang out and their community infrastructure that lives with it vanishes overnight after extreme weather events. And this is because this group of I firmly believe that many queer populations globally are some of the most vulnerable populations, and their spaces are often temporary and liminal. And if these spaces are destroyed by the effects of the climate emergency, that makes it so much harder to rebuild and remake. I'll give an example of this, and this was a natural disaster, not a climate emergency, but I believe it shapes the narrative. It very much tells how things are. And this was in the Aravani of Sri Lanka. The Aravani are also a third gender, and they had the fate of the Aravanis, particularly in Sri Lanka, provides us a useful window to highlight how we've been made invisible as queer people from humanitarian and development organizations. In fact, after the 2004 Indian Boxing Day tsunami, which led to millions of deaths, we saw that as NGOs and humanitarian aid organizations came in to provide support afterwards, the Aravanis themselves were denied access to both social care and medical support because of the discrimination from both the state and from the NGOs themselves. They were invisible under the population because they don't appear in any damage assessments that the government and relief organizations did afterwards. So they were denied bedding, shelter, and food. Many of the camps were set up for women and men, which meant that the Aravani themselves didn't have a clear space in which to go. And when they did go to either a woman's camp or a man's camp, they were then denied entry to it. So as well as being an oppressed minority in Sri Lanka who find employment in things like begging and dancing. Many of them lost their very small businesses, therefore deepening themselves into poverty, such as their makeup, their dancing costumes, and their jewels, which they used for employment, which meant that because they weren't logged afterwards and or recognized by the state, they had no recourse to funds from either humanitarian organizations or the state itself. What made this worse is that people needed to be a registered resident of the municipality in order to get food aid. But that often involves sharing your permanent address with the police, which then blocked some queer people from seeking support. In a nation state which at the time, Sri Lanka, it was illegal. You're certainly not going to hand over your address to the police if you fear that arrest in order to gain food aid. But also, if we're looking at up to 30 to 40% of the world's population who are homeless being queer, then you may not have a permanent address to register yourself afterwards. So these are all of the conversations we need to be having. These climate disasters, furthermore, we also see times of lawlessness after climate disasters, where we're seeing more pressure on scarcer resources. Homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia and interphobia rise to the surface, where pre-existing stigma can be weaponized by communities to gain resources or to enact violence or harm, knowing fine well that they can do this without impunity or with any consequence of harming other people. So Mozambique, for example, is regarded as one of perhaps the friendliest nations in Africa for sexual and gender minorities. But when Cyclone Idai happened in one of its cities, we saw the compounding difficulties faced where more people were led to inadequate housing, more women were vulnerable, particularly queer women, to gender-based violence. And we saw in this, many of people's homes were destroyed, which led to the heightened visibility of queer women and trans women, and therefore to the vulnerability of them. And so we started to notice cases of corrective rape of queer women happening as a result of this. So you can see the knock-on domino-led effect, can't you? And how we are intimately tied to the climate emergency itself. This means in places like the Philippines, when the super typhoon Yolanda saw gendered lines drawn in their relief efforts, where queer people not only faced the shock of the superstorm itself, which destroyed, flattened everything, but also they had unique challenges due to their minority status too. There was a focus on gender in disaster relief, and rightly so. But the problem being is the recovery efforts were based around a very binaried cisgender man woman category, which makes it deeply problematic for many, and in fact many native and indigenous in some cases gender minorities being excluded from livelihood initiatives in terms of gaining access to sanitary information and food supplies. But also, when seeking safety after these events, Hurricane Katrina in the USA identified this significantly in terms of queer populations. In 2005, it left many people with obviously homeless and sanitation services swamped. People were forced to live in football stadiums, temporary camps, on dry grounds, and so on. But when seeking safety, many trans individuals were heightened as discriminated against and even denied entry in huge flooded plains to dry spaces or access to emergency shelters. In fact, 2 trans individuals were arrested because they'd used the bathroom of their own gender at a temporary emergency shelter. But then to make matters worse, queer people were then blamed as the cause of the hurricane by some religious leaders or denied aid from faith-based organizations for lacking the ID that matched their name or their gender. And therefore, many queer people who were in relationships and families or had children themselves were isolated from US state disaster relief policies and benefits because it was all for married heterosexual couples And this happened at a time when the USA had not legalized marriage until 10 years later. So you can see the debilitating effect even after extreme weather events, not only during, but when people then seek safety and efforts from not just the state, but humanitarian organizations to come to their aid. We further see this in the Haitian earthquake in 2020. Many queer people were documented being denied access to emergency housing and relief. In Nepal, when there was extreme weather events there, we saw a smallholder farmer who identified as a third gender, which is part of Nepalese culture, actually actively excluded from helping to build and offer to help to build housing and to take cover and shelter housing because they'd use a sex-segregated cisgender binary. In Australia, in the 2011 floods in Queensland, it was revealed that 43% of queer individuals felt afraid of the actual evacuation centres and even during the recovery process afterwards. We saw Hurricane Maria in Northeast Caribbean in 2017, where we saw many pharmacies destroyed or lost their electricity. That meant that the generators very often were destroyed. So they were unable, many queer populations who live at heightened risk in many cases of HIV, they were unable to get their antiretroviral treatments or hormone replacement therapy prescriptions to those who needed it. So we see even knock-on effects in terms of medical access to quite unique needs. So clearly, we are not all feeling the climate emergency equally. This isn't the great equalizer. This is something that is deeply targeted. We're seeing our lives as queer people entwined with the climate emergency itself. We're seeing that not only during, but we're seeing it afterwards in relief efforts. And we not only face untangling ourselves from the climate emergency, which is impossible, but we also face state-led and community-led homophobia and transphobia. The two forces combine to make deeply problematic scenarios for queer people globally. And I must give a warning around this one, because we are going to be seeing a shift in narrative. We are seeing the rise of the far right amongst a large part of the world. And we will see tensions emerging in the global south as the climate emergency continues to see wide-ranging effects on environments. This will lead, because of the effects of the climate emergency, particularly in the global south, that will lead to increased refugee movement from climate refugees. Interestingly enough, the UN doesn't recognize a climate refugee, but I believe they should be, because this will include queer people who, again, are more at risk, who, again, very often live on the margins of society, and again, are more likely to be homeless. We're going to be shifts in movements. However, the problem being on this one is that this feeds into narratives which are used by far-right parties, political parties, and governments who will blame queer people as refugees who come to the global north. That means that becomes a tool, not only in the global north to stigmatize queer refugees, but I believe it will be used by governments and leaders in the global south as blaming queer people as a cause of extreme weather events. I mean, we've seen the evidence already, people already doing this. And so we're going to be seeing no space as a safe space. So the effects of this could see, potentially, the stripping back of human rights of queer people in the global south even further. And of course, the building of walls in the global north to stop refugee movements shifting upwards. And we know we are living under what's a rise of strongman leaders, whether it's Trump or Putin or anyone else, who this would be perfect for them to fuel their own narratives of blame. And therefore, we will become a scapegoat for their own crises that they are mismanaging themselves. And this is a worrying trend. So we're even linked as queer people. Thank you, Doha. Yeah, where minister from the ruling party in India said cyclones are caused by queer people. We're seeing this happening already. So it's even linked to the rise of this far right, and it's deeply disturbing. So some evidence of that came, and this was a while ago now in 2014, but we in the UK, we had an MP uh, who said that, as a former Conservative MP, said UK storms were divine retribution for gay marriage. Um, and blamed the storms that were happening on gay marriage being legalized. But also Hurricane Harvey was used from evangelical Christian leaders who have said that obviously we know it's the climate emergency doing this, but we're being blamed. Just like I said, we feed into a narrative of a far right. In fact, the Minnesota Republican blamed global warming on Pride Month itself, and interestingly then said, as I predict, would like to turn back the clock on LGBT rights. This exactly feeds into what I've just mentioned before. We will see the strip back of LGBT rights in the global south and potentially the global north, but we will be used as blame functions to do so. So my argument is, as I said at the beginning, if climate change is a back of the mind issue, then indeed queer people and the climate emergency are beyond the back of the mind issue. We haven't been talked about. We haven't had engagement in the climate emergency debates, and we really need to be doing so. So this is a call to action to all of you out there. Engage with the queer communities, have those discussions, because I'll end with some what needs to happen before I'll hand over to Lewis. And some key points and takeaways to get from this is that first of all, our governments need to ensure that queer communities are safe in terms of crises. They need laws and policies which tackle climate disasters inclusively. They need to understand that this is intersectional. Um, and so, therefore, as a result of that, we also need, as queer people, to be placed at the forefront as equals in the climate emergency debates. Because I'm not sure about you, but I've seen very few events and discussions on the climate emergency which have talked about queer lives and populations. So we need to be placed at the forefront too. We need to be in agenda setting, removing us from the beyond the back of the mind population under threat and placed at the front of the mind. But in order to do this as well, we do need nation states to maintain the push toward a decriminalisation of harmful, very often colonial laws, which obstruct some of the world's most vulnerable queer populations to be able to engage in that agenda setting without fear or harm. But also to have safe places to go after extreme weather events. We all need to be aware of the far right in order to tackle the blame culture which will emerge as climate emergency stirs into action even further. So localized issues facing queer people really need to be feeding into wider global trends, because we need to ensure that the most vulnerable people, be it the homeless queer people, be it third gender, indigenous populations, do not slip through the net and become isolated when those extreme weather events happen. And I believe very strongly, and we've done this a lot at Report Out, that the voices of queer people in the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 discussions need to be addressed. And we need to pay very close attention to Goal 13, climate action, if we're to see anything happen. So begin these conversations, folks. We need to be talking to environmental organizations as perhaps a number 6 point that I haven't put on there. Engaging with those environmental organizations are key, because we're doing very little as a queer community to engage environmental organizations and vice versa. So we need to change the narratives. We have a report. If Lauren, if you could please drop the link into the chat. We've started to do some report on this. It's called our Green in the Rainbow project. We undertook a research project looking at the climate emergency and its effects. And it was an interesting start to the discussion. We asked LGBTQI plus organizations, are you prepared for the climate emergency? And the resounding answer was no. So now is the beginnings of changing the narratives. We'll put that link in the chat. We hope you do read it. And we hope that you too want to lead in the discussion as well, or just take away learning points from today and help us to do that. Okay, I hope you found this informative. And I want to thank you very much for listening and taking a time to do that and hear my very passionate discussion around this. But I'm going to now hand you over to Lewis, who is our amazing trustee at Report Out as well. Lewis, it's over to you.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you for sharing that overview and the detailed studies that you actually look at on climate change and climate emergency, the term you use. So now I'll be starting to share my screen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who's listening here today. Nice to be here. I'm currently based in Singapore. So if anyone is also in Singapore, you can let me know. We can always meet up for a meal. And let me start by sharing my screen now. So hopefully everyone is able to see my screen. So as Drew shared earlier, so currently I'm the trustee with Portfolio for Sustainability and Climate Change in Report Out. And what we do basically is that we look into how Report Out can actually support different climate initiatives. How can we as a charity actually play our part so that we can contribute to this this sector as well and not be a bystander. So for me, what I would be doing in the next 5 to 10 minutes is to share what we are doing and to share a quick overview on what the climate emergency is, which I'm sure Drew has already shared a lot on that. So if there's no further questions, I'll begin. And if anyone has any questions along the way, feel free to just type in your chat, or you can also contact me after this session with my contact details on the second last slide. So I think we heard a lot about the climate emergency, and of course this is something that we all do not want to be faced with, but we have to be realistic and know that it's already here with us today. So for instance, in Singapore, there's this news article about climate change being here and now. I'm not sure about different parts of the world, but I'm sure it's similar. Is that different parts of the world are facing the hottest days ever. For example, in May 13th in this year, we actually, in Singapore, which is where I'm based, we actually had the hottest day in 40 years, where the temperature actually hit 37 degrees Celsius. And even 2022, which is last year, was actually one of the wettest years since 1980s. We also see that Europe has actually started this point that we must actually end this war on nature. And how do they plan to do so, and why do they plan to do so? It's because besides the concept of carbon, I think it's also important to also look into the biodiversity space. And the global wildlife populations have actually dropped by about 69% on average since 1970s. So I think this is also one area that we as a society, we as an organization, we as human beings in essence have to also look at. Thirdly, another article that I thought was quite interesting was how Australia and New Zealand actually issue statements at Climate and Finance Dialogue. And the purpose of such statements, which I'm sure many other countries are also working on, is that they are trying to navigate shared economic challenges and opportunities, because different countries and different companies are trying to hit their net zero goals. But how can we see it not just as a challenge? How can we work together to actually collaborate and share resources? Which I think is also what we are trying to do here at Report Out, is that if we can work with different organizations to combine our efforts to share knowledge with one another so that we can all be in this journey together. And last on this slide is for those who are based in US, there has been about $2.6 billion framework being announced. And this is basically looking into areas such as looking at tribal priorities for habitat restoration and increasing different biodiversity, for example, fish population. So I'm sure there's many more different types of grants and frameworks that governments are already doing, which I think is a good step forward, but I believe much more can be done. And we should not only rely on governments, whether we are individuals, whether we are companies, whether we are societies, we should also look at where can we actually play our part in this journey together, and see this honestly as a challenge, but see this as a fun challenge to be part of, that no other generations in our world previously can see this as much as a challenge as what we are feeling today. So here's an overview of three key areas that we have to look at how the climate emergency is actually really happening. So these two charts on the left shows that the carbon dioxide level has been consistently increasing. The first chart being since 1960, and the second chart dates back much further to look at 800,000 years before today. And I think the purpose of this chart is to show that yes, there has been there's basically still two debates currently from what I'm hearing, is that is the climate emergency really caused by mankind? And if you look, I have read through a lot of different types of papers and research which I can share more, but basically there has been a clear correlation that at least in the past 100 years, that because of the rise or the increase in population of humans and what we are doing for economic growth, there has been a much greater increase of carbon dioxide. And as we all know, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and among 6 or 7 other different types of greenhouse gas, and therefore there is a direct link to how is it causing our temperature and how is it causing precipitation change to be much more severe. Secondly, is if you can study the Antarctica mass variation that is clearly dropping, and the reason why is because if global temperature is rising due to different forms of greenhouse gas, the high temperature will obviously cause the ice to melt even more. So this is a chart that actually illustrates that clearly, which therefore leads to the last chart on the right, which shows how global temperature is on a steady increase and is of course accelerating much more because of mankind. Moving on, this is on slide on IPCC, which as Drew has also mentioned earlier in one of his studies. Basically, I wanted to highlight the IPCC states that there is a huge difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees. I'm sure many of you know that the world I think there is, as the day passes, the chance of us ever possibly hitting a 1.5 degrees Celsius target is much lower, but we still have to try. And we may wonder to ourselves, why not just aim for 2, which is much simpler? Maybe there can be more economic progress or all sorts of ideas. But I wanted to highlight that there's a huge difference if the planet is at 2 degrees Celsius increase versus a 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this can be seen on the left-hand side. For instance, for the point of extreme heat, if it's 2 degrees Celsius, a whopping 37% of the global population will actually experience severe heat at least once every 5 years. This is clearly much more than the 14% if it was a 1.5 degrees Celsius, and therefore the impact is 2.6 times worse. So in the future, if you ever hear about the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees Celsius concept, I think we should still try to aim for the 1.5 degrees Celsius as best as we can and not just only stick to 2. So now I will be focusing on what we as a charity are looking at doing so that we can be involved in this journey together. So first, I wanted to share the idea of sustainable procurement. And what is sustainable procurement is that basically integrates responsible business practices and sustainable corporate behavior into our procurement process, policies, and decisions. And it's very important to look at that we are trying to balance sustainability, profitability, and making stakeholders' requirements. Now, these definition is basically can be used for charities, can be used for organizations, can be used for any different types of bodies in essence. So now I'll be sharing on the left-hand side. The left-hand side shows the GHG protocols. What is it? Basically, it's the greenhouse gas emissions protocols, and there's 3 scopes. Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 types of emissions are basically those that the company directly has influence over. For example, if there are emissions from the company's facilities or from company's vehicles, that is Scope 1 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 2 are indirect. For example, if we use electricity in office buildings, etc., that is Scope 2. And Scope 3, for most organizations, Scope 3 is the majority. And I believe that if, for example, for report out, Scope 3 will be a predominant part of our emissions. So what is Scope 3? Scope 3, there are 2 forms. There is upstream and downstream. Upstream meaning the emissions from when the product that we are using was produced from, and downstream is where will the product that we produce, if assuming we were a manufacturing facility, which we are not, but if we were to manufacture products downstream, what would the emissions in total be? So the purpose of me sharing this is because I think that when we look at the product to choose, when we look at which sort of resource should we want to have for our events, we would have to consider the carbon embedded in the product that was created, because obviously we want to choose the one with the lowest embedded product in the production process. And how can that happen? How do we know? I think there's different studies and different analysis that we can do, but even things such as asking ourselves, is the product that we are looking at using, is it recycled? If it's recycled, there's a good chance that the embedded carbon in our product is actually much lesser than a completely new product in manufacturing process. So that's the reason why I'm sharing the GHG protocol. And on the right-hand side are things of what do we have to do as a charity. For instance, we can actually ensure that the scoring criteria for supplies and contract renewals have relevant sustainability considerations. What does this mean? This means coming up with a matrix on what do we look out for when we engage with suppliers for even our event catering. What do we look out for, and do the suppliers actually conform, or do they follow such requirements? I think it's important because suppliers themselves may not really see the impact on climate change that they possibly can contribute to. But if we have such guidelines, we can actually help to guide suppliers along this journey as well, and therefore increasing our influence to help in this climate journey. So that is the reason why. And moving on to the next slide, I wanted to briefly share the idea of a circular economy, which was briefly touched upon when I mentioned about recycling. I think in the past, traditionally, organizations or items in our society have been on a linear economy model, which is a take, make, and waste sort of a pathway, which means once we buy the product, we use it and then we throw. I think such as a way of thinking of way of life is quite wasteful, but we should actually look at how can we repurpose, how can we recycle, how can we remanufacture items so that they can have a new life after they have been so-called being used up. And by doing so, it would significantly, I believe, reduce the amount of carbon emissions that is being contributed to the planet. So here's quite a beautiful butterfly diagram by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is quite well known. So if anyone has any questions on this diagram, you can let me know after the session as well. So then what are we doing as Report Out? So here are some goals, a non-exhaustive list of what we are looking at in the environmental, social, and governance space. I wanted to highlight that sustainability is not just about the environment, it's not just about carbon, but it's also about social and governance. Because I think organizations can have perfect environmental records, but if they are treating their workers bad, their employees not well, or if there's a lot of corruption in the organization, then there's no sustainability in it at all. So to have a balanced approach, we took it across the ESG framework, and therefore here are a few of our goals that we will adhere to. Moving on some practical tips that we can do at online and offline events in the next slides. So basically, Report Out, most of our events are this year, and probably definitely a significant amount next year will be online events. And therefore, what can we do even though if it's online, or how can we actually reduce our carbon? So I think it's a misnomer that online events have no carbon emissions. There are carbon emissions, is that but of course it's much significantly lesser than if they were offline events. So here are 6 different things, once again non-exhaustive, on what we can do if we were to attend online events. For example, I think that's if there were any material, let's look at the 4th point together. If there's any materials to be shared, it can be shared via a compressed media file before sharing so that the carbon emissions from the files will be lesser. Of course, if there's any unnecessary emails and files, you can delete it to take up less email space, because if we use a cloud service, they are usually stored in data centers, and we know the data centers emits a lot, is very power and energy intensive. Moving on to offline events, which we will also have. So on the left-hand side is event materials. Ask ourselves if the items that we are procuring, can they be reused? Or when we develop materials, can we develop in a way that is not only for one-time use, but actually much more? Also, can we actually share our message well? Next is on food types and caterers, is that we can reduce our food miles and choosing organic options. Can we switch from bottled waters to tap waters, for example? And also, maybe we can even use things such as reducing, choosing our food wisely, etc. So here are a few tips that anyone can also consider using in your organizations if you were to have offline events. The last main slide will be that some key updates that we have actually signed an agreement with NCVO on divesting from fossil fuels, because we believe that investing in fossil fuels is a risky investment, and the fossil fuel industry faces increasing challenge, for example, the transition to renewable energy and the threat of climate change regulations, which will be implemented in majority of the countries. So we have already signed this agreement, and under this agreement, it implies that we will divest our investments away from fossil fuels and will follow the principles. Just a note that we do not have any investments currently with fossil fuels, and because we signed this agreement also, we will not have any as well. Lastly, this is my personal contact, my email, my LinkedIn. You can contact me if you have any questions regarding what we are doing here and report out. Happy to chat more. And thank you, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lewis. So just to keep us on time, everybody, I think what I hope you're seeing here is that we're not just talking the talk and highlighting the problems that are going on globally. We're also walking the walk, and we are trying to report out to ensure that we also are doing the best possible for our internal systems. And we wanted this to do two things. We wanted, one, to tell you about what's happening regards queer communities in the climate emergency, but also two, hopefully give you some ideas about what you could do and ask of your organizations as well. And I think as sexual gender minority populations around the world, we know we are some of the most vulnerable populations. And so therefore we need to be at the front end of this discussion point. So we really hope you've enjoyed today. We don't thankfully have any questions because we would have about a minute left to answer them, Lewis. But it's lovely to see your responses coming in there. So thank you everybody for attending. We hope that you have an amazing time, and we'll finish on time today. So thanks, Lewis. Much
Thank you.
appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for coming along. Take care.